Imagine stepping out into a London evening in the 1850s. The air has that particular Victorian quality, a heavy mixture of coal smoke, damp mist, and something you can't quite name, but which makes you instinctively walk faster. And if you were part of the upper class, you might think you were strolling through it untouchable. Money, after all, meant separation from the filth and sickness that claimed thousands every year. Right? Not quite. But before we get to the details, I'll just pause to say, if you're listening right now, take a slow breath, let your eyes soften, and if you're enjoying this gentle drift through history, you can like the video, leave a comment, or subscribe so you won't miss our next midnight wander. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Because in Victorian London, no matter where you lived, whether a cramped, airless attic or a grand Mayfair townhouse, disease was closer than you'd ever want it to be. The rich weren't simply bystanders watching from the safety of their drawing rooms. They were, in many cases, one unlucky servant, one glass of contaminated water, or one social visit, away from a fever that didn't care about bank accounts or pedigrees. If the poor were constantly surrounded by visible hazards, sewage in the streets, crumbling tenements, and overcrowded workhouses, the upper classes faced a subtler but no less dangerous kind of threat. Their enemies were invisible, cholera bacteria hiding in a perfectly respectable-looking jug of water, tuberculosis lurking in the lungs of an elegantly dressed dinner guest, smallpox floating through the air of a glittering ballroom. And in a city where miasma theory still dominated medical thinking, even the rich were busy sniffing at perfumed handkerchiefs, hoping the scent would keep out bad air. The irony, that sweet-smelling lavender sachet might be clutched in the same hand that moments earlier touched an infected door handle. By the middle of the century, London was home to about 2.5 million people, the largest city in the world. But its sanitation systems hadn't caught up with its size. The water supply, even for wealthy neighborhoods, often came from the same rivers and reservoirs contaminated by the waste of poorer districts. It didn't matter if your bed was carved from mahogany and your sheets were Irish linen. If the water in your porcelain wash basin came straight from the Thames without proper filtration, it carried the same risks as the water in a slum dweller's tin cup. And then there was the social factor. The rich had to be seen at the theatre, at balls, in church pews, at dinner parties. These were crowded, enclosed spaces, often heated just enough to make the air thick and close, perfect for transmitting diseases like influenza and tuberculosis. Servants came and went between households, acting as unknowing carriers of illnesses. Even personal doctors, moving from one patient to another, might bring infection along for the ride. Some illnesses were even seen as almost glamorous in the early Victorian era. Tuberculosis, for example, was associated with delicate beauty and poetic suffering. The pale skin, bright eyes, and thin frame it caused became fashionable traits, romanticized in art and literature. But beneath the romantic image was a disease that killed slowly, and which could move just as easily from a scullery maid to a duchess. By 1854, Dr. John Snow had already suspected that cholera was spread through contaminated water, not foul air, a radical idea at the time. His famous investigation in Soho, tracing an outbreak to a single water pump on Broad Street, would reveal the truth. But for most of Victorian society, the belief in miasma persisted. That meant people took the wrong precautions, opening windows to let out bad air, while still drinking from tainted supplies. For the wealthy, outbreaks sometimes came as a shock. How could disease invade neighborhoods with paved streets, fresh paint, and manicured gardens? The answer was as unsettling then as it is now. Germs don't care about class boundaries. If the river is polluted, the water in your silver teapot is polluted. If the air is thick with coughing in a crowded music hall, your silk gloves won't protect you. The myth of aristocratic immunity was, in reality, one of the most dangerous illusions of the 19th century. And in the next section, we'll step through the polished doors of a Victorian townhouse to see exactly how disease could slip inside, undetected, until it was too late. The wealthy of Victorian London thought themselves immune to the suffering of the poor. They had the high walls, the plush drawing rooms, the gas lamps that burned all night in hallways lined with mahogany. They had private carriages to carry them from their townhouses to the opera, avoiding the mud and manure of the streets. They had servants who drew their baths, laundered their linens, and carried their food to the table. And yet, illness drifted through those same gilded halls like an uninvited guest. It's a strange thing about disease. It doesn't read bank ledgers. It doesn't care for coats of arms or dinner invitations from the Lord Mayor. In the 19th century, it was perfectly possible for a family who dined on imported grapes in January to wake the next day to the same fever and shivers as the washerwoman who cleaned their floors. The illusion of safety was built on two pillars: isolation and belief in cleanliness. Neither was quite as solid as it looked, a house that breathed in sickness. We imagine the great townhouses of Mayfair or Belgravia as sealed-off sanctuaries, but they were anything but airtight. The constant opening and closing of doors by footmen, the arrival of coal deliveries, the visiting of tradesmen, each break in the threshold allowed the air of the city to drift in. And in Victorian London, that air was thick with filth. The miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air, was still the dominant medical explanation for illness well into the century. Doctors told the rich to avoid the fog that rolled in from the Thames, but they could not stop the invisible particles of cholera-contaminated water or the microbes that clung to a servant's coat after a trip to the market. Ironically, the great houses often had indoor plumbing earlier than the poorer districts. That should have been an advantage, except Victorian engineers sometimes connected their water pipes to the same contaminated sources used by the slums. A fine porcelain wash basin means nothing if what runs into it is laced with sewage. Servants. The invisible carriers. A wealthy household might employ a dozen or more servants: cooks, maids, footmen, coachmen, laundresses. These workers often lived in cramped, airless quarters in the basement or attic of the house, sometimes with only a thin wall between the kitchen and the servants' sleeping spaces. When disease entered their world, through a trip to the market, a visit to family, or contact with other servants, it had an easy route upstairs. But Victorian manners required a certain invisibility from the servants. The mistress of the house might not notice a maid's cough until it had already spread through the household, and the servants themselves, fearing the loss of wages or dismissal, might work through fevers and chills, carrying trays and shaking out bedclothes with contagious hands. The false comfort of fashion. If you were wealthy, your clothing in the mid-1800s was a badge of status and often a hazard to your health. Corsets restricted breathing, making lungs less able to fight off infection. Layer upon layer of fabric meant clothing was rarely washed in full, only brushed or sponged on the surface, which made them perfect carriers for lice and fleas. And those grand social gatherings, the glittering balls, the operas, the dinner parties, were the perfect places for microbes to mingle. 100 people breathing, laughing, coughing in close quarters, sometimes in poorly ventilated rooms heavy with the smoke of oil lamps. You could dance a waltz and catch an illness before you reach the second turn. Charity balls and hidden dangers. The wealthy liked to see themselves as benefactors to the poor. Charity balls raised funds for orphanages, workhouses, and soup kitchens. Ironically, those same events often became hubs of transmission. A charity event might include visits to the institutions they were funding. A lady in silks might spend an afternoon touring a workhouse filled with sickly children, shaking hands and offering treats. Then she would return to her carriage, bring home the same gloves she had worn, and hand them to a maid to store away. The disease didn't need much more than that. The water problem. By the middle of the century, a battle raged between private water companies, each supplying different districts with varying quality of water. Some drew from the Thames downstream from the city, effectively ladling up sewage and sending it straight to the taps of the wealthy West End. To make matters worse, the rich consumed more water than the poor, not just for drinking, but for baths, kitchens, fountains, and gardens. When cholera struck, it struck where the water flowed, and in London, the water didn't care if you wore rags or silk. The doctor will see you now. For the wealthy, a doctor's visit was expected at the first sign of illness. But Victorian medicine was an unpredictable business. Bleeding, purging, blistering, all were still in the medical toolkit, and all could weaken the patient further. Physicians moved from house to house, often with little understanding of germ theory, until later in the century. In their rounds, they might carry the illness from a merchant's home in the East End straight to a banker's mansion in Kensington. Some wealthy families insisted on their doctors washing hands or instruments, but this was not universal practice until well after Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister's work began to filter into the medical mainstream. The social trap. For the rich, withdrawing from society entirely was unthinkable. Declining invitations too often could damage reputations and influence. So even during outbreaks, the wealthy attended dinners and theatre performances, each gathering another chance for contagion to leap from host to guest. Some did retreat to country estates, but even there, illness followed. Servants still travelled in and out. Tradesmen brought goods, and letters and parcels moved freely along postal routes. The disease moved with them. An unequal but shared fate. What made this reality sting for the wealthy was not only that they could get sick, but that the symbols of their privilege, servants, social gatherings, fine houses in fashionable districts, were the very channels by which illness reached them. The poor suffered more, without question. Their mortality rates were staggering compared to the upper classes. But the image of the wealthy as untouchable was shattered again and again by outbreaks that made no distinction between drawing rooms and alleyways. When typhus or influenza swept the city, the newspapers would sometimes print the names of the notable dead: a duke, a banker, a famous actress. The reminder was clear: money might buy a grand headstone, but it couldn't buy immunity. In Section 3, we'll follow disease into the one place the wealthy most believed themselves secure, the grand dining room, and how their own indulgence sometimes became their undoing. The thing about disease in Victorian London was that it didn't read calling cards. Germs didn't pause at the threshold of a grand townhouse, tip their hat, and turn politely away. They slipped under doors, clung to the hems of skirts, and rode inside on the damp air that curled in from the Thames. And if you were rich, well, sometimes you made things worse for yourself without even knowing it. You see, Victorian wealth was often on full display: ornate homes, endless banquets, glittering parties, and all of it required one essential ingredient: people, servants, staff, guests, deliverymen. The very ones who kept your household running could, unintentionally, be the ones who brought death to your door. Even the wealthiest homes depended on the outside world for their survival. Coal for the fires, milk for the tea, fresh bread in the morning. All of it came from the same bustling, crowded city where cholera, typhoid, and influenza thrived. And these tradesmen moved freely between neighborhoods. One day they were delivering to the East End, the next they were in your marble-floored hallway. If disease had a favorite pastime, it was hitching rides across the city in the company of perfectly respectable businessmen. The myth of the safe household. Many upper-class Victorians truly believed their homes were sanctuaries, cleaner, safer, healthier than the cramped tenements of the poor. And, in some ways, they were. These homes had space, ventilation, and servants to keep things tidy. But cleanliness in the 1800s was subjective. You might scrub the floors and polish the silver, but if your water came from a contaminated source, and in London it often did, you were just making a very clean home for very deadly bacteria. The very layout of grand Victorian houses worked against them. The basement kitchens and attic servants' quarters created two entirely separate worlds under one roof. Servants lived and worked in tight quarters, often without much fresh air, making them perfect breeding grounds for infection. They didn't just cook the meals, they tasted the sauces, arranged the platters, and carried steaming dishes into the dining room, all without any awareness of what germs were. Germ theory was still being argued about in medical circles, after all. And the guests. They came in from all over the city, bringing more than just gossip. In an era when blowing your nose into a cloth handkerchief was considered elegant, no one realized they were basically carrying a reusable pocket of contagion. When charity backfired, the Victorian elite prided themselves on their charitable work. Visiting hospitals, hosting charity balls, delivering baskets to the poor. These acts were part of their public identity. But in their eagerness to help, they sometimes walked straight into the most dangerous places in the city. Wealthy women in silks and feathers would visit workhouses, leaning close to comfort sick children or speak with coughing mothers. Then they would return home to their families, often with more than warm feelings in their hearts. For diseases like tuberculosis, it didn't matter how fine your drawing room curtains were. All it took was one afternoon of good works, and the infection was on its way to your private parlour. The trouble with servant mobility. Victorian households often had a revolving door of staff. Servants moved from one position to another, sometimes changing employers several times a year. This mobility was great for a servant's career, but terrible for public health. A footman recovering from illness might take a new job in a wealthy household, his lingering cough politely ignored so long as he could carry the silver trays. A cook who'd been nursing a fever could still find work in another kitchen, because replacing staff was a constant necessity in the upper classes. And since servants had friends and families scattered across the city, they also carried stories, food, and, unintentionally, sickness from one home to another. A single ill maid could unknowingly serve dinner in Mayfair one week and Belgravia the next, spreading disease with every serving spoon. The disease loop. Once illness entered a household, the loop was hard to break. Servants fell ill first, but they still had to work. There was no paid sick leave in the 19th century. They served the master's tea, dusted the lady's writing desk, and polished the children's toys. Soon enough, the family would show the same symptoms, and once the master or mistress was sick, the doctor would come, possibly carrying germs from his last patient. The loop tightened. In some cases, wealthy families would leave London during outbreaks, retreating to country estates. But even then, they took their staff with them. Staff who might already be infected. All they really did was move the disease from the city to the countryside, ensuring it had a pleasant rural holiday. It was the go-to solution for wealthy Victorians. If London's air was killing you, then leave London. Families would pack up the trunks, bundle into their carriages, and head for the countryside. The fresh breezes of Surrey, the bracing winds of the coast. And on paper, it made sense. Fewer people, cleaner air, no open sewers lining the streets. The newspapers even published tips for healthy retreats, complete with lists of the best hotels that promised country fresh meals and sanitary comfort. But the problem was this: they never went alone. You see, the upper class was not in the habit of carrying their own luggage, preparing their own meals, or even stoking their own fireplaces. Their lives were a constant entourage. Footmen to open doors, cooks to prepare suppers, ladies' maids to brush hair, grooms to care for the horses. And so, when the household decided to flee the city, the servants came too. Servants who had been working in the close, stale quarters of London homes, who might have been tending to sick relatives in their evenings off, or who might be showing the first pale signs of illness themselves. One could load a carriage with lavender sachets and boiled water, but it did nothing to stop what was already sitting on the seat beside you. The countryside was not immune. The reality was, disease didn't respect boundaries on a map. While the countryside was cleaner in theory, it wasn't untouched. A small village could be perfectly healthy one week, and the next, a visiting household from London would bring an outbreak with them. The disease spread silently. A coughing maidservant delivering tea, a groom with a fever tending to the local stables, a child's hand clasped during a polite greeting. For the wealthy, this could be embarrassing at best and deadly at worst. Rural gossip travelled fast, and once the locals suspected you'd brought sickness, polite invitations to tea disappeared. But illness didn't require a social call to do its work. It spread in dining rooms, through shared wash basins, even via the linen hung out to dry in the same shared yard. Doctors in rural areas were already stretched thin. A sudden influx of wealthy patients didn't necessarily mean better care. It often meant a scramble for supplies and medicine that could run out quickly. False comforts of private sanitation. One of the favourite selling points of country houses was private sanitation. In theory, this meant no shared street pump, no public privies, only clean, self-contained systems. In practice, it usually meant a private well and a cesspit somewhere in the garden. But if that well was downhill from the cesspit, and Victorian builders were not always sticklers for such details, you had the same problems as the city, just with prettier views. In winter, when frost locked the ground, these waste systems could overflow or freeze, sending contaminated water into the very barrels the household was drawing from. Some families, proud of their rural estate, never considered that their grand lawns might be sitting atop a health hazard. The journey itself. Even before they arrived at these safe havens, the journey was a risk. Carriages were enclosed spaces with poor ventilation, perfect for the spread of airborne illness. The trip could take hours or days, depending on the destination, with stops at coaching inns that saw dozens of travellers each day. Inns were notorious for reusing bedding, and blankets that had warmed one feverish guest in the night might be folded neatly and offered to the next without so much as a shakeout. The wealthy might dine in a private room at these inns, but the food still came from the same kitchen where a coughing pot boy might be stirring the soup. In other words, the moment you left London, you entered a chain of invisible handshakes with strangers you'd never see. When the escape failed, Some families never made it out in time. Disease moved faster than the carriages. By the time a household decided to leave, half the staff might already be showing symptoms. The decision to flee could end up trapping them in the carriage with the very sickness they were trying to escape. The countryside became a sick room on wheels. And yet, for all the risk, the belief in escape was hard to shake. It was comforting to imagine that safety could be reached by simply crossing a county line. That in the soft green of the country, among the hedgerows and frosted meadows, sickness could be left behind. But Victorian London's reach was long. It travelled in trunks and tea baskets, in the folds of wool coats, in the breath of a servant who had never been given a day to rest. For the rich, the countryside was rarely a cure. More often, it was just a new place to get sick. The last breath of winter. The winter of 1866 drew to a close with a cruel paradox. In the drawing rooms of London's great houses, heavy velvet drapes muffled the sound of carriage wheels splashing through half-frozen slush. Fires roared in marble hearths, tea steamed in delicate porcelain cups, and a few pale crocuses were beginning to push through the thawing gardens outside. To an untrained eye, the city seemed to be shaking off the season's chill. But for many of the wealthy, the thaw only revealed what had been quietly killing them all along. Illness, that stubborn guest, was still in the house. The cholera outbreak of the previous years had left its ghost in every water pipe and pump handle. Influenza, the fashionable complaint, as one satirical paper called it, still spread among society gatherings with all the efficiency of an urgent letter. Typhoid clung to the same silver spoons and gilded goblets that had been polished for a spring ball. And the truth was unavoidable now. Money had never been the barrier they thought it was. For every wealthy household that had fled to the countryside, some had returned to find their London homes stripped not of furniture, but of servants. A trusted maid gone back to her family, meaning she'd fallen ill and been sent away to die quietly. A cook replaced twice in one season because the last two couldn't keep up with the work, a polite euphemism whispered in the servants' corridor. In May of that year, Lady Harriet Bellamy, who had once insisted that disease is for the poor, attended a small dinner at the home of a close friend in Mayfair. It was an intimate gathering. 12 guests, a modest menu of spring lamb, early peas, and cream pudding. The laughter was warm, the wine generous, and the air perfumed with the first hothouse roses of the season. 4 days later, Lady Harriet was confined to her bed. Her doctor suspected influenza, perhaps caught from the changeable weather, but her husband suspected something else entirely. The footman who had served the lamb had been brought in from another household that very morning. His former employers had sent him away for coughing too often during service. By the end of the week, 2 more of the dinner guests were ill. These stories spread in low voices across the parlours of London. Not the sensational accounts you'd find in the penny press, those preferred tales of filth in the slums, of reckless poor families who brought disease upon themselves. No, these were whispered exchanges between hostesses over tea, the knowledge that a single servant with a fever could turn a season of soirees into a season of funerals. It began to shift the tone of the city's elite. Invitations carried subtle cautions. Only our usual circle, no new staff. Some dinners became bring-your-own-servant affairs, as absurd as it sounds, families arriving with their own footman in tow rather than trusting the household staff of their hosts. A few even took to quietly checking where the servants had come from last, tracing them like parcels to see if they'd passed through unhealthy districts. But even these precautions were little more than social theatre. No one wanted to confront the truth that the infrastructure of London itself was a breeding ground, and wealth could not buy its way out of shared air, shared water, and shared streets. The sewer projects had begun, yes, but not fast enough and not everywhere. The Great Stink of 1858 was less than a decade behind them, and the very river that glittered under the moon from their dining room windows still carried invisible dangers. By the winter of 1867, the city would face yet another wave of illness. Some households would weather it without a loss. Others would quietly shutter their windows and retreat to the country, not returning until the first real heat of summer. And always, in the background, the servants moved, from house to house, kitchen to kitchen, carrying not only letters and trays, but stories, gossip, and the occasional cough that no one wanted to hear too closely. For the rich of Victorian London, disease had rewritten the social map. It had reminded them, in the most impolite way possible, that no matter how high their ceilings or how fine their silver, they still lived in the same city as everyone else. A single sneeze, a sip of tainted water, or a handshake with a trusted employee could undo centuries of inherited fortune in a matter of days. And so, the season turned again. Spring flowers in Hyde Park, crowded rowing boats on the Serpentine, and drawing rooms alive with the sound of conversation. All of it carried on with the polite fiction that the danger had passed. But beneath the silk and candlelight, a new awareness lingered, something no amount of wealth could erase. That when London fell ill, it did not ask your name, your title, or the size of your fortune. It simply came in, sat down, and made itself at home.